Welcome to Messy Liberation, the podcast that dives deep into feminism, business, and personal growth. I'm Becky Mollenkamp.
And I'm Taina Brown. Get ready for another messy conversation through the eyes of two intersectional feminist coaches.
Let's get messy. Hello.
Hello, good morning. How are you?
I'm okay. That's an actual I'm okay.
Yeah.
Like I could do better, but I could be worse. So I'm okay.
Yeah.
How about you?
I'm the same. I'm the same. I'm a little bit tired, but I'm always tired, so that's nothing new.
Same. Ditto.
So this week I added a new thing to like my morning routine. So there's a park across the street from our house, and it's less of just like picnicky type park and more like athletic field park. So we get a lot of like activity on the weekends with like soccer leagues and peewee football and softball and things like that. So this week I started incorporating into my morning routine just like a walk around the park. So that's been a nice thing to add, get some sunshine, get out of the house almost first thing in the morning. I still have to have my coffee.
I mean, you're well on your way to becoming a billionaire since you even have a morning routine. Isn't that what all those white dudes who talk about how to get rich is like? You have to have a morning routine.
Yeah,
of course, you're not doing cold
4
plunging.
a.m. Yeah, you got to wake up at 4 a.m., do cold plunging, drink
your
protein
matcha
powder.
or whatever.
Yeah.
Apparently now you got to drink your own urine, but we won't even go there.
My God.
I know. That's what the white guys are doing to prove how masculine they are.
I'm
not
sure
okay why drinking urine is masculine and not just idiotic, but whatever. I think maybe those two things are synonyms, masculine and idiotic.
Sometimes they are, but that's another conversation for another day.
So let's just start by saying, when you're listening to this, if you're listening to this the day it drops, it's the day before the election.
Yeah.
To end all elections. Let's hope not. It's the election to hopefully save all elections, but it's the big election. So like, I just want to acknowledge the elephant in the room. You may not be listening to this. You may be listening to this in the future and you know what we don't yet know, which is what happened. But we also are tired of all of it. And I think you might be too. So we thought, instead of talking about the election, which you can get everywhere today, if you're like us and are like, I just want to hear about literally anything else. Yeah. I was listening to NPR this morning, which when we're recording this is just before Halloween. And they were doing a story about porn and love and sex addiction. And it got me thinking about sex work and those sorts of things. As somebody who's raising a young boy, I was sort of like, when I heard some statistic they shared, I think it was 90+% of children by age 14 have seen online porn. That's not surprising, I guess, but it still makes your heart kind of stop when you're the parent of a child who you want to protect and keep safe and all of that. And it does bring up for me, as a feminist who supports sex work, a lot of thoughts and challenges around those beliefs and balancing all of that with wanting to raise a child, especially a boy, who grows into a man who respects, because I do believe my son is heterosexual as of now, and raising a man who will respect women and who understands. I want him to have an understanding of sex. And I also want him to not fall victim to or become one of those guys who's watching porn that's really unrealistic, really unethical, really gross. Anyway, lots of thoughts around all of that. So we could go anywhere talking about sex work.
We really could.
I thought we would talk at least about porn and ethical porn. Oh, the other thing that had me thinking about this, just to throw it out there too, was just yesterday, and I shared about this in the Feminist Founders newsletter today, Lily Allen, who's the musician who's I think she had the big hit that was like, fuck you very much, or whatever. Yeah. And I think she's had some other songs. And I think I've read some things about her being problematic in some ways. So this is not specifically about her, but she had just shared that she makes more money from selling photos of her feet on OnlyFans than she does from Spotify for her music.
Wow.
Which is like, we could go down the whole rabbit hole of why Spotify and the corporate influence inside of music is so problematic. But I would rather focus on the OnlyFans piece to say, there's a lot of real money in OnlyFans, and there are a lot of people who hate it. And also, I'm pro sex work, so why would I be against OnlyFans? And obviously, people are making good money. Women are making good money. That I think that story to me really highlights how even somebody who's been ridiculously successful in her industry can make more money from sex work than she can.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we call feet photos sex work or not, but whatever.
Yeah.
So anyway, those are some of my initial thoughts.
I mean, it's a kink. So I would call feet photos sex work. Where to begin?
I know,
honestly.
right?
So, okay. So here's where I'll begin in terms of my thoughts and feelings about sex work. So when I lived in LA, I was a part of I joined a feminist organization, a feminist activist organizing group. And for me, it was a way to meet people because it's really hard to make friends in LA. I mean, it's really hard to make friends as an adult, period. But then in a city like LA, like that's exacerbated by the culture and like people's expectations about what relationships should and shouldn't look like. So I was like, I came across, I think their Instagram or something. And I was like, oh, this might be a good way to like get with some like-minded folks who are, to be quite honest, not white, and just do work that is meaningful and also potentially make some friends along the way. I ended up leaving the organization because we were moving, but even if we hadn't decided to move back to Atlanta, I probably would have left the organization anyway because of their stance on sex work. They were adamantly against sex work because of the way that it intersects with like power structures and power dynamics, right? And the history of forced sex work of Black and brown women, which you can't erase that history. It has to be a part of the conversation. It has to be a part of the analysis when we talk about sex work. However, I think for me, I felt like the way that they went about it was unethical. And I say that, or what I mean when I say that is there were instances in which they were partnering with other organizations who had a different stance on sex work. And they would like have time for like stage presence at events and things like that. And they would get on there and like not talk about what they said they were going to talk about and instead talk about why sex work was bad. So like little things like that, just really, to use what the kids are saying these days, gave me the ick, because it's like, I understand their stance and I wasn't necessarily trying to convince anybody in that group to change their mind. Except for the fact when they said, oh, we shouldn't call it sex work. We should call it forced prostitution. And I'm like, no, because if you ask anyone who chooses to be in that work, that shit is work. It's work. So let's call it what it is. It's sex work, regardless of whether or not it's forced or not. That's a different conversation. I felt like they were they were sabotaging their own efforts at other issues because of their insistence that everyone that they collaborate with, every single organization that they partner with, concede to their values on sex work. And I think in this day and age, when there's so much complexity that we're talking about, there was so much complexity that we experience, we can't afford to lose partners in the work. We can't afford to lose allies in the work. And I'm not saying that you have to compromise like your values 100%, but I think when it comes to certain things, like, and we talked about this in a previous episode, right? On the episode about values, right? Like it's a spectrum. And so I get that they were like, this is a black and white issue for us, but I think it was just really hurting their efforts to, like, it was corroding trust that they had built with other organizations in the city. And so I probably would have left the organization anyway. Sadly, I didn't want to leave, but I was like, I can't get behind this. I felt like it was unethical. And I think when it comes to sex work, there is the history that we have to acknowledge and talk about with forced prostitution. I think the question isn't, the question isn't only what do we do about the history of sex work, but like, what do we think about the future of sex work?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, too, I guess we need to be clear. I'm very decidedly anti-forced sex work. I'm very anti-decidedly like forced any labor.
Yeah.
Sex or otherwise. And to me, those have to be separated in the same way we can't talk about having employees and then pretend that that is the same as slavery.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're talking about, those are two entirely separate conversations.
Yeah.
I'm happy to talk about all of the reasons why the ways that so many corporations manage employees are problematic, but we have to like it has to be separated from the idea of forced servitude. And I don't know how anyone can have a genuine and ethical kind of conversation around sex work and not separate those two, because it is so disingenuous to compare or to pretend that all sex work is forced.
Yeah.
I could go on, but I mean, I think, and I'm sure you're on the same page with me as saying like, we're clearly against forced sex work.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Period.
Absolutely. Like, I don't think anyone should be forced to do anything that they don't want to do. And I think what I struggled with in that situation was that it wasn't a both and conversation. It was an either or conversation. And I'm not comfortable in those spaces. I'm not comfortable with that much certainty in anything because we live such complex lives and because issues are so nuanced and so complex. And I felt like a lot of their philosophy around sex work was coming out of trauma from that their communities have experienced. And that was informing how they were relating to other people. And not that the trauma isn't valid. It's absolutely 100% valid. But when it gets in the way of necessary relationship building and coalition work in order to move towards a more equitable and just world, at that point, you're doing more harm than good, I think. And when it comes to sex work, like, I think this is such a complicated, or not complicated, it's such a nuanced issue. And there's so many layers to it because there's a conversation about the systemic issues with sex work, right? Because you can be on OnlyFans selling feet pictures and making more money in OnlyFans like Lily Allen, as opposed to as a very well-known and loved by a lot of people, musician and artist and creative. But like, we still have to have an analysis of like the power there, right? The power dynamics there. Does that mean that you should never sell your feet pictures on OnlyFans? No, right? Like, I think context matters. I think every angle needs to be interrogated, right? And so I think there's a way to engage in sex work that helps people to tap into their agency and their power that they might not otherwise be able to do. And there is a way to do it ethically that doesn't re-traumatize populations, doesn't re-traumatize the individual, and resist the system of domination by white, cis, hetero, able-bodied, wealthy, white, men, right? And so I don't really, in my own personal life, like I used to watch a lot of porn when I was a lot younger. I don't watch a lot of porn now. I hardly ever watch porn now, to be honest. But I know that there are ethical porn sites out there that
I want to talk about
consent.
Because that is something I have explored to try and find more about, both for myself, but then also for my child as he eventually gets older and it's inevitable. He's going to want to look at porn. And I want to figure out, how do I provide options for him that are ethically made and that are more ethical representations, I think, of what consent and realistic sex is. Because I think part of the problem too is, even when it's consensual, I think one of the issues I have with pornography is the representations that are being given to very impressionable and also beyond impressionable, just men in general, and specifically men, because most porn, the majority of porn is heteronormative and it is mostly geared towards men.
Yeah.
That does not mean that women don't enjoy porn and that people who don't like heteronormative sex don't like porn. But the bulk of what's out there, the majority, is for that particular audience, because there's this belief that I think is false, but it's a belief that men like porn more than women, right?
Yeah.
I wonder how much of that is also, though, because of the kind of porn that's available for us to consume. But I worry about what the messages are sending to men about expectations around sex, about what sex should look like, how women are supposed to show up in heteronormative relationships around sex. It is scary. As a mom now, like, it was always, I never liked it as a woman either, right? That men expect that women are supposed to like have these orgasms just through penetration that are wild and loud and exuberant, and that men should be throwing women around, and that they're, that every woman enjoys being, gagged or right. Yeah. And like, no shame for people who enjoy those things, but it became very normalized that I think the expectation became sex has to be this certain way. And then that unfortunately leaves many men unable to enjoy normal.
Yeah.
And I don't mean normal in a way that other stuff is abnormal, but just like routine kind of sex, right?
Yeah.
Non-porn sex. It leaves me
Just
men
like
unable to
very
enjoy it.
vanilla, basic.
Right? Because guess
Yeah.
what? Sometimes you might enjoy the other stuff and that's great too. And maybe you like it all the time. But I think for a lot of people, it's kind of like sometimes you have the wild sex, sometimes you just want to have the quiet sex, the easy
Yeah.
sex, whatever it is. And if men aren't able to enjoy it because it has become so ingrained in them that it has to look a certain way, that is usually a power problem, power dynamic issue. That's a problem. And so I've been looking for ethical porn, and some of the stuff that calls itself ethical, I don't know. My hope is it is at least ethically made, right? Because one of the major issues with porn is it actually being ethically made? Is it truly consensual? Are we free from the power dynamics that don't allow for this to be true consent, despite maybe a woman saying yes in it? Is there actual consent, and can there be real consent? So maybe the ethical porn addresses that, but I struggle to find porn that addresses some of these other issues around what is normal or what is, I hate using that word, but like what is okay and what should men expect? And also just like pick the kind of women that show up in porn. I think it's starting to change because I do think that homemade porn or whatever that genre is becoming more popular, which means there is less of the like implants and the airbrushing and the whatever. Again, no shame for those things. And we need to have porn that's more representative of all folks. And that has not historically been the case. Porn has been very young, right? The barely legal category has always been a very, very popular category, usually the number one category for the last few decades of porn. So very, very young, very, very thin, very
enhanced.
Large, enhanced in all the ways, like, right? Their body, like
digitally and like physically.
Right. And white, primarily white. So there's been a look of what porn represents, and that has only further caused problems, I think, for so many young women girls to young women to women, of how I'm supposed to show up. How do I measure up? Not just out in the world and how I'm viewed everywhere else, but then also in the bedroom. So I have so many issues with porn, and I consume porn sometimes. I don't think porn is inherently a bad thing. I don't think watching people have sex, people who want you to watch them have sex, none of that I think is bad. I just think the piece that you're talking about, the systemic, this is where it's messy, right? Because we can't just talk about the individuals inside who are making a choice. That's one reason I like OnlyFans, by the way, a lot. I don't subscribe to anything, but the concept of OnlyFans, where it's an individual making a choice to sort of empower themselves to do this thing. I like that a lot better than what I often see in porn, which feels much more like all of the systemic issues that are at play when people are trying to profit off of someone else's labor for sex. I think prostitution, when there's no like person involved, a madam or a pimp or whatever, when it is you making that empowered choice on your own and you reap the financial benefits, I think those one-to-one transactions, I'm like, hell yeah. Right? It's when other people start to get involved that things get murkier. It doesn't make it wrong necessarily or bad necessarily, but I think that's where you're talking about. It's not so easy. It's not so like, it's always good or it's always bad.
Yeah, it's not a black and white thing. As you were talking, what came to mind was Uses of the Erotic by Audre Lorde. And I know a lot of times people reference that work of hers as like a method or a process for finding wholeness and authenticity in yourself. But let's be clear, she also talks about like masturbation in that piece. Like it's encoded language, but she's talking about masturbation. Like when she's talking about the kernel of butter and like massaging it and things like that. This was a Black lesbian in the 70s. It's not free of the sexual embodiment that was really prevalent for Black lesbians and lesbians in general at that time. And so what I love about that piece, right, is that obviously it applies to like finding wholeness and authenticity into your life, but it can also apply to sexual relationships, right? Like her whole premise in Uses of the Erotic is that the opposite of the erotic is the pornographic. And any time that you are engaging in any kind of relationship, whether it's sexual or not, and there's no real space for you to be completely yourself in that moment. There's no real space for you to feel completely in that moment. If at any point you feel like you have to cut off part of your feelings, right? Whether it's a physical sensation or an emotional feeling, then that is the definition of the pornographic, right? Then in that moment, you are not engaging in actual eroticism, because eroticism allows space for the chaotic, messy part of your feelings, whether that's physical or emotional. And so I don't know if this exists, but I would love to see, porn on site that's like based off of these principles, like not just in action, but like literally says, we are the Audre Lorde of porn, right? We are the Audre Lorde of sex work, right? Because I don't think sex work is going anywhere. Like there's no way, like, for as long
oldest
as
profession, right? Isn't that what they say? Like,
right,
I mean, yeah,
right.
It's always been here.
Like,
it's always going to be here.
It's a tool for people to explore things about themselves in a way that should feel safe, right? That should feel consensual. I think a lot of times it's not that. And that's where a lot of the problems lie. I honestly don't know of any ethically produced porn. But I love what you said also, that it's not just about how it's produced, but it's also about the representation, because a lot of times, I know in the disability community, a lot of the issue around porn is that there's no disability representation. And so
unless it's as a specific kink.
Yes.
And again, there's nothing wrong. I don't think either of us are here to kink shame. So I feel like I don't need to have this pop up keep coming up where I need to keep. But just to be clear, there's in any conversation I'm having about this, I have no kink shame, no nothing.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is when that's the only option, right?
Yeah.
When the way you show up is only seen as a kink. I think the same thing for fat women, right? It is only seen as a kink. The same thing for older women. It is only seen as a kink. So all of those things, like it's fine when that is a kink, and it shouldn't only be
that. Yeah, because that's what shifts the power dynamic.
Right.
When it is only a kink, then what you're doing is you're disempowering someone from that community. And so if there is wide representation that's consensual, that's ethically made, that pays equitably, right? That's safe, that allows people to show up in their wholeness, then I think a lot of the issues that some people might have with like pornography and sex work wouldn't exist, because there's space for people to explore all of that. Have you read? Well, I don't know. I don't know if you have anything to say, but anything else to say? I'm sure you do.
Well, let me really quickly, because you mentioned uses of the erotic, which I absolutely love. And I pulled it out here so that I could read. I was like perusing, trying to remember what would be good. And I'm going to read just one paragraph that I feel like speaks to some of what we're talking about, because it also just gets to this part about call it like pornography. And I think that's part of the issue. The erotic this is a quote. The erotic has been misnamed by men and used against women. It has been made into the confused, the trivial, the psychotic, and the plasticized sensation. For this reason, we have often turned away from the exploration and consideration of the erotic as a source of power and information, confusing it with its opposite, the pornographic. But pornography is a direct denial of power of the erotic, for it represents the suppression of true feeling. Pornography emphasizes sensation without feeling. And I just think like that's one piece. And I love this entire, by the way, Sister Outsider, Audre Lorde, like every essay in here is amazing, but it includes uses of the erotic. And I love this essay for so many reasons, because to me, you can read it in so many ways, right? There's so many layers where you can look specifically at what we're talking about now, which is eroticism and pornography and all of that, but also like all these layers of just pleasure for women, even if we take out the idea of porn and that, like it's the ways that as women and as anyone who's has a marginalized identity, that our pleasure in all of its form, including sex, has been, is bastardized a good word or a bad word, has been made into something that is used against us, that is denied of us, right? That is like, and I think this gets to it, because I think the problem is porn, but it's not porn that's it's not sex work. It's not watching sex that is the problem. It is that it has been turned into this pornography version that is this, like she said, this plasticized, like really devoid of any feelings, power imbalance sort of thing. And what I think we're saying is, where's the erotic? Where is the true representations of pleasure? Where is the images that center our experiences? Because almost all porn, even I've noticed porn that is theoretically not for men, right? Like lesbian porn, it is still centering the male gaze. It is all about that instead of, because I've watched woman on woman porn a lot, and that's not
how it happens.
That is not.
A lot of times that's not how it happens.
Right. And it's not what women who actually enjoy being intimate with women, that is not what I want to see. That is not, because it's not what it is. In the same way, I don't want to watch those representations of sex with men. And it's challenging. I will say I have found audio porn is an area, because men have been conditioned. I don't know that I firmly believe that they are biologically wired to be more visual, but they have been very conditioned to be visual.
I don't believe that either.
Yeah. But I think they're conditioned to be very visual. So audio porn, I think, is still an area that is more geared towards the female listener, because there is this belief that women are more about stories and feelings and all of that than men. Again, I think so much of that is our conditioning and not real. But because of that, I have found there are a lot of audio porn sites that do a pretty good job of actually centering women's experiences in a powerful way. But if you want visual as a woman, and you should also have the access to that, it's more difficult to find. Which is why, like, I think OnlyFans is probably something worth exploring. But even there, I wonder how much of that, as an independent person, they're still centering the male gaze, because I think the piece we haven't talked about is shame. And the way women have been made to feel shameful about having desires that we all as humans have. We all have desires to have sex. We need to have the desire to have sex. That's how humans exist, how we sustain ourselves, right? And there's nothing shameful about pleasure and about sex, but women are so specifically made to feel bad about that, to feel shameful about that, that I don't think that, like, we seek out, I think, from what I've noticed, you tell me what you think, very often women are seeking out porn in a way that's like quiet.
Secretive.
Yes. We don't even know. And so they're not making it for us, because I don't know that they believe we actually want it. And those who even are maybe doing it in a more empowered way still feel like they need to center to make it for men in order for it to be profitable. And ultimately work should be paid. Sex work should be paid. I want those women to make great money, but it sucks that there's this belief that it's hard to, like, you can't make money by centering the female gaze.
Yeah. I think what you were talking about earlier too about I don't remember what you said specifically, but it just, this whole conversation, right, about the erotic, the connection of the eroticism, and Audre Lorde's definition of what eroticism and pornography is in relation to sex work. Like, it makes me think of, like, this conversation I was having with a client once about the embodiment, like how we embody our lives. And so much of Western society, Western civilized, quote unquote, society is focused on thought, right? I mean, we can take it back to the whole I think, therefore I am, Cartesian philosophical premise, right? Which is the premise of the objective, the scientific method, right? Objectivity and things like that, which is still taught in schools today. And we buy into that idea so much that we lose touch with what it feels like to be in our bodies. And I think that's why I theorize, I have a theory that that's probably why sex work is as prevalent as it is, because it's an avenue for people to feel in their bodies. But what's happening is you can't choose one or the other. You can't choose, I'm going to be fully embodied, but not think. And you can't choose, I'm going to think and not be fully embodied. Like, you have to be able to marry those two things together in order to be a fully actualized person. And most people are doing one or the other. They feel like they have to pick and choose, and you don't have to pick and choose. You can engage in sex work and in pornography and in kink, hopefully in an ethical and consensual and holistic way. Like, don't just go out there and do something that's not safe for you, but you can engage in those things while also holding on to this concept of, okay, let me think about what I'm actually doing. how does this feel in my body? Because those two parts, that's what makes you as a whole. And so I think it becomes dangerous when we move to the complete opposite extreme, where it's like, well, I'm just going to do all embodiment and not really have any kind of critique or understanding of the systems that I'm participating in.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it made me think about the ways our bodies, the ways we are made to be disembodied from, right, to the ways that our bodies are, especially, so I think of it as women. Obviously, that's my lived experience. So as women, as girls, our bodies become so objectified, right? We talked about this in the past, at least, so for white women, and I know we talked about too, Black women have a different experience often, but generally as white women, our bodies are like these precious things to be protected as girls until we reach this certain age when our bodies change. And then suddenly we become objects, right? To be ridiculed, to be abused, to be touched, to be everything, but you become a body and not a person. And I think for Black women, as we talked about with Black girls, that often happens much earlier than it does for white women. So white women often have this period of being protected as a body. And then it's like this head snapping kind of like, now suddenly I am nothing but a body, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is not mine to be valued. And so because we are like forced out of our body, we are like, I think many of us are forced into this contentious relationship with our body at such a young age, where you almost are made to hate it because it is the source of so much trauma and pain. So I was thinking about that as you talked about that, but then I was also thinking, let's be real. Like, I want to be not generous, real about men and their experiences, because the truth is young boys are typically victims of sexual assault at a higher rate than young girls. Now that shifts often in very much as bodies change, right? So older girls and into young women, that radically shifts, where now suddenly women are at a much higher rate than men victims of sexual assault. But in childhood molestation, it is young boys that are at a much higher rate. And so boys are also disembodied in so many ways, right? And they are made to believe that their body is only meant for often either this defensive posture because of bad things that can happen, or aggression. And often their trauma then, because the only emotional avenue that they are allowed is anger, the way they deal with their trauma is anger. And so their whole experience with bodies becomes like projecting out their pain, their trauma by hurting other bodies, right? Which is why I think a lot of that shifts as they get older, right? Men go from being boys who are abused to becoming men who abuse because they are not given any other emotional language to deal with their trauma and their pain. And it becomes this like, this is what I know. I'm angry. My body was hurt. I'm going to hurt bodies. And then women learn that, well, we are the source and the object of abuse. And so like when you look at the whole dynamics of how our bodies are treated inside of the bigger culture of, we all live inside of a puritanical culture, whether you're religious or not. America is, if you live in America, but a lot of the world, America is founded on puritanical religious beliefs, right? So we are all ingrained in all of that shame, plus all of this trauma and this disembodied stuff. And I guess the big piece where I sit with, and I always struggle because pro-sex work, pro-ethical porn, pro all of these things. And is there any real way inside of all of the stuff we just talked about to create truly ethical porn? Like, because can any of us really fully separate ourselves from all of those systems and ever know if what we're doing inside of sex work, whether we're consuming or creating, like, is there any way to know, like, have we actually truly freed ourselves from all that? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I just think it's so fucking complicated because you can't escape all of the bigger stuff, even when you try to do something a little better. So then I think like, yeah, you're making money on those feet pics. Love it. Take him for all he's worth. And would you be doing that if we lived inside of, like, is it something you actually enjoy
You want to do?
right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. And that's really, so I can see where some people get into that place of porn's just bad because we can never escape, or sex work is all grounded inside of these bigger systems. I don't go there and I don't agree with that. I used to back in my like youth when I first sort of had my feminist awakening and I was part of that sort of third wave feminism. I had that moment of like, all sex work is bad. I've moved beyond that, but I do still sit with some of that like core question that I have no answer to.
Yeah, I think that's an important question to sit with because we say all the time, or I know I say all the time, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. And if I really believe that, I have to apply it to sex work as well because it's a consumer based service or product. And where I fall with that, or where I feel like I can contend with that in a way that's not going to drive me insane, is that, well, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, but I still buy groceries and I still buy technology and I still go to the movies and I still go to shows. You know what I mean? Like, and so there is no way for us to completely escape that. And I think we cannot look at it as a black and white issue. We have to look at it again as a spectrum, right? Like, how much, if you are into, porn or sex work or anything under that umbrella, how much of your time spent engaging in those activities is pulling you into toxic capitalism, and how much of your time spent there is pulling you away from toxic capitalism? And what are the means of production? What are the means of the distribution of money and power and things like that? Like, and how is it informing your daily practice in terms of how you relate to other people? Because if you are engaging in sex work for 5 days a week and it's starting to affect like how you think about women, or how you think about non-binary folks, or how you think about who has power in the bedroom and who doesn't have power, right? Then that starts to become toxic. And so if you can engage in it in a way that doesn't pull you in to the toxicity that can be found there, then I think you're in a good place. But if you find yourself creeping towards that tipping point, then you need to be able to pull yourself out and have a community that can keep you accountable about it, right? Because the other thing that we haven't addressed here at all is that, like, there's this, and this was part of the issue with the organization that I was with in LA. It's like, I not always, but sometimes would bring up the idea of like, okay, I get that y'all are against sex work, but it's not for us to tell someone what to do with their body. Right. So
Yeah, it made me think of abortion. If you don't like sex work, don't participate.
don't do it.
Don't consume it.
Participate.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. But don't tell other people what they can and can't do.
Right.
Ethically.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's this premise that like that's an individual decision, or that's something that's harming a community. And it's like, it's actually both. It's not one or the other. It's both. So if you are engaging in sex work and you are not rooted in community in some sense, that to me is toxic, because then where's the accountability? Then where's the safe space for you to go to ask questions or talk about things that you may encounter while you're engaging in sex work that you might be confused about, right? And so I think as an individual, like, you cannot separate yourself and just be like, oh, I'm just going to do this thing because, oh, it's just me. No, but like, how is that affecting how you relate to your community, and how sex work as a whole also affects your community?
Yeah. And I think just talking about ethical consumption, we know that not paying for something isn't ethical.
Yeah.
So if your only source of consuming sex work is free websites, which is probably a lot of people, then that's something to really explore, because it's not ethical. And I don't want to shame people for it, because I have a feeling the reason so many people do that is shame-based.
Yeah.
Because they want to see how quickly can I dip in and out, be done with this, clear my browser history, hope no one ever knows, right? And if I'm paying,
I've been there,
right?
So.
If I'm paying for it, what does that say, and all of that? If you're still operating so much out of that shameful place around sex, there's such work to be doing there before you're consuming. Because if you're operating from that shameful place about sex, then you're probably not making anything close to ethical consumption decisions, or more ethical consumption decisions.
Yeah.
Right? In the same ways that if you haven't done any unpacking of white supremacy or any of these things, you're probably not making remotely ethical decisions about capitalist consumption, right? Or more ethical decisions. So I think doing some of that work on ourselves to then begin to say, now I want to bring this into all the aspects of my life. I've been doing it thinking about the places I shop for my groceries or whatever. What about how I'm consuming sex work, whether that for me looks like porn or prostitution or OnlyFans? Am I really thinking about from whom I'm consuming, how I'm consuming these things? Is there ways for me to do it more ethically? And I'm going to mention Dipsea. That's the place I was talking about. It's Dipsea Stories. So DIPSEA. And I'm going to link to it in the show notes. Just to be clear, I don't know them personally. I have no idea. But everything I've read about it is really wonderful. It's run by 2 women, both white women. So I want to be clear about that. So I'm sure there's probably room for improvement. But their whole thing is that they're trying to build, I'm going to read what it says. We're building a universe of spicy audiobooks and romantic fiction where the female gaze is always front and center. And their whole thing is about stories by women, for women. It's a company owned by women. Everything is about and geared towards women and centering women. So they're trying to do fantasy and eroticism in a more ethical way. Again, it's only audio. I would love to see more of this approach being brought into video. But start searching it out. Even things like, we didn't even get into sex toys because I know it's a slightly different, but it's still sort of part of the sex work business. Where are you buying your sex toys from? Yeah. Because there are certainly toys that are more and less ethical, both for the world, and the way the products are made, but also who's benefiting from those sex toys, who's making them, who's profiting off of them. Are they actually made for the ways women want to receive pleasure? Yeah. So I just think all of it, we need to bring that same critical lens to our consumption in the sex space that I think we often do elsewhere. But because of all of this shame, I don't know that it's happening here. Yeah. And there's lots of room for improvement.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. If you're listening or watching and you want to explore what it means to marry your thinking brain with your embodied person, I highly recommend the book Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Marie Brown. It's actually an anthology of from different writers and organizers and activists about how pleasure can be part of your resistance, can be part of your work as someone who wants to be anti-capitalist and understand intersectionality and all that. And then we'll put this in the show notes, but there are websites that are owned by women, run by women, prioritize women and non-binary, gender-neutral pleasure. If you are looking for sex toys that aren't coming from a website that gives you the ick, we'll put that in the show notes.
Sex toys I have found, the audio thing I have found, it is the video area. Yeah. I would love to know too. So messyliberation@gmail.com. If you have discovered, and don't worry, we'll keep it anonymous if that's something that is anyone, because I understand the shame around these conversations still. No matter how much work you've done, you can still feel it in there because we are so ingrained in it. But if you have found more ethical ways to consume sex work, whether it's a really amazing ethical OnlyFans producer or somebody who's out there doing porn through a website that actually includes visuals or non-visual things as well, or sex toys, let us know. messyliberation@gmail.com. We'd love to be able to share more of that because I would love to be able to highlight more of these things.
Yeah. So. Thanks for listening today.
Yeah. And wish us all luck tomorrow as we listen to this live when the election's happening. And if it's after the election, you may need some masturbation to help calm your nervous system.
Yes. Yeah.
No shame. Enjoy your body and the pleasure that it can bring you. So thank you for listening. Thanks for listening to Messy Liberation.
Will you please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen?
I know people say that all the time. And if you're like me, often you just go on to the next podcast. But truly, taking that moment to do that will really help us reach a wider audience.
Thank you so much for your support and for listening today.
Until next time.